In 1911, fewer than 400 federal forest rangers were responsible for protection of nearly 150 million acres of public land. That imbalance of numbers is where this life begins, because the ranger of the Forestry Service was born from arithmetic that did not favor the human being. The problem was not romance of wilderness. It was fire, timber, theft, watershed collapse, and the blunt mathematics of extraction after rapid industrial expansion of the late 19th century. Railroads demanded ties by the millions. Mines demanded beams. Cities demanded fuel. Between 1880 and 1900, estimates vary, but more than 190 million acres of forest across the United States were cut, burned, or degraded without coordinated oversight. A lesser-known design compromise defined the earliest ranger districts. Boundaries were drawn along watershed lines rather than political lines, sacrificing ease of governance for protection of downstream water supply. The parents were politics and catastrophe. The creation of the United States Forest Service in 1905 under the Department of Agriculture formalized what had been a patchwork of reserves. Leadership under Gifford Pinchot emphasized sustained yield, a doctrine of use rather than preservation. Alone, the Great Fire of 1910, also known as the Great Fire of 1910, burned approximately 3 million acres across Idaho and Montana in 2 days, killing at least 86 people, most of them firefighters. A lesser-known command doctrine, shift, followed that fire. The agency adopted a policy of total suppression of all wildfires by 10 a.m. the day after detection, formalizing aggression against flame as a moral imperative. Early prototypes of the ranger were simple: a horse, a sidearm, a badge, a map drawn from incomplete surveys. Communication depended on telegraph lines strung across mountain passes and on lookout towers erected on ridges at elevations exceeding 2,000 meters. Pay averaged $900 per year in the 1910s, with responsibility extending across territories larger than some eastern states. A lesser-known supply constraint shaped those early years. Funding for boots was so limited that rangers were issued 1 pair annually, leading to improvised repairs with rawhide and wire. Childhood was isolation. A single ranger might patrol 300,000 acres alone, traveling 20 to 30 miles per day by horse. Reports of timber theft required confrontation without backup. Disputes over grazing rights carried risk of violence. Training was minimal, often learned by apprenticeship rather than academy. A lesser-known crew training detail from archival memos reveals that early rangers were instructed to memorize terrain features rather than rely on maps, because printing updates lagged behind seasonal changes of river courses and logging roads. Misunderstandings marked the early decades. The doctrine of total suppression treated all fire as enemy, ignoring the ecological role of low-intensity burns and clearing underbrush. Between 1910 and 1935, suppression rates exceeded 95% of detected fires in many districts. Fuel loads accumulated quietly. A lesser-known weather and terrain impact compounded this. Decades of suppression in ponderosa pine forests led to tree densities increasing from historical averages of 40 trees per acre to more than 300 in some stands, creating ladder fuels that later enabled crown fires of extreme intensity. Small changes mattered. Introduction of motorized vehicles in the 1920s cut response times by hours, though rugged terrain limited use. Development of portable radios in the 1930s replaced reliance on heliographs and signal mirrors. The establishment of the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1933 injected 300,000 young men into conservation work at peak enrollment, constructing roads, trails, and fire breaks. A lesser-known production issue emerged in early radio deployment. Battery life in cold mountain environments dropped by nearly 40%, forcing rangers to ration transmissions during winter patrols. Growth accelerated during mid-century. Post-war timber demands surged, with annual harvests from national forests rising above 12 billion board feet by the late 1960s. Ranger districts expanded staff, standardized manuals, codified procedures for fire suppression, grazing permits, and law enforcement. Aircraft entered the system, with smoke jumpers, parachuting into remote ignition points. A lesser-known test result from early smoke jumper programs in the 1940s showed injury rates exceeding 10% per season, leading to a redesign of parachutes and helmets rather than abandonment of the tactic. Logistics matured into a complex web, fire caches stocked with tools, Pulaskis, shovels, chainsaws were pre-positioned across regions. Interagency agreements enabled mutual aid between federal and state units. Weather stations multiplied, feeding data into predictive models of fire behavior. A lesser-known battlefield improvisation during the 1949 Mont Gulch fire involved deployment of an escape fire, a technique of burning a small area to deprive an approaching wildfire of fuel. Though controversial at the time, it later informed formal training in entrapment survival. The Ranger became symbol and instrument. Campaigns, such as Smokey Bear, launched in 1944, shaped public perception of fire as preventable catastrophe. Visitor numbers to national forests increased from 18 million in 1945 to more than 150 million by 1960, expanding responsibilities beyond timber and flame to recreation management. Law enforcement duties intensified with growth of illegal dumping, poaching, and unauthorized road building. A lesser-known countermeasure adopted in the 1970s was use of controlled burns, rebranded as prescribed fire, reversing decades of doctrine and reducing surface fuels. By measurable percentages in treated areas, peak arrived in a paradox of competence and strain. During the 1988 fires in Yellowstone, more than 1.2 million acres burned, challenging suppression orthodoxy. Rangers and firefighters numbered over 9,000 at peak deployment, supported by aircraft flying 18,000 sorties. The event tested flexibility of doctrine and resilience of personnel. A lesser-known command doctrine shift during that season recognized limits of suppression under extreme drought, allowing some lightning-caused fires to burn under monitored conditions rather than pursuing total extinguishment. In a defining scenario from that period, a Ranger crew confronted a fast-moving crown fire, advancing at estimated speeds of 2 miles per hour under winds exceeding 30 miles per hour. Terrain was steep, slopes above 40% grade. Decision calculus balanced risk of entrapment against value of structures below. The crew withdrew to safety zones pre-identified through mapping of fuel breaks and rock outcrops. A lesser-known medical effect recorded after that season showed elevated rates of respiratory illness among personnel exposed to prolonged smoke, with particulate concentrations often exceeding 300 micrograms per cubic meter. Why did the system work at its peak? Because it had evolved beyond single tools. Aircraft, ground crews, meteorologists, and incident commanders operated under the incident command system, a standardized structure adopted nationally after catastrophic fires in California during the 1970s. Communication protocols reduced confusion. Logistics units tracked supply lines down to gallons of retardant dropped per hour. A lesser-known supply constraint during large incidents involved availability of aviation fuel at remote airstrips, limiting sortie rates despite availability of aircraft. The cost accumulated in bodies and minds. Between 1910 and 2020, more than 1,000 wildland firefighters died in the line of duty in the United States, many of them Rangers or attached crews. Injury rates during intense seasons could exceed 20% of deployed personnel. Fatigue was constant. 16-hour shifts over weeks became routine during major incidents. A lesser-known psychological effect documented in internal studies identified symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder in approximately 15% of surveyed wildland firefighters after extreme fire seasons. Fear was not only of flame. Rangers in remote districts confronted illegal marijuana cultivation sites, armed poachers, and occasionally violent confrontations over land use. Law enforcement training expanded, firearms qualification becoming standardized. Survival, math-governed patrol, radio check-ins every hour, GPS tracking in higher risk zones, minimum crew sizes for certain operations. A lesser-known crew training detail, introduced in the 2000s, required annual refresher, courses in situational awareness and ambush recognition after a series of armed encounters in western forests. Old age of the traditional ranger began not with retirement of individuals, but with transformation of landscape. Climate change lengthened fire seasons by an estimated 78 days in parts of the western United States between 1970 and 2016. Average annual acres burned increased from around 3 million in the 1980s to over 8 million in the 2010s. Fuel loads accumulated from a century of suppression intersected with drought and insect infestation. A lesser-known weather and terrain impact of warming temperatures involved elevation shifts of bark beetle populations, enabling infestations above 9,000 feet that killed millions of trees and created additional standing fuel. Technology altered the role. Satellites provided near real-time detection of heat signatures, drones surveyed inaccessible terrain, predictive modeling software integrated wind, humidity, and topography into simulations. The ranger became data analyst as much as rider of horse or driver of truck. A lesser-known production issue with early drone adoption involved interference with manned aircraft during suppression operations, prompting strict airspace coordination protocols. Doctrine shifted again. Recognition of fire as ecological process gained dominance. Managed wildfire replaced universal suppression in certain conditions. Thinning projects aimed to restore historical forest structure. Community preparedness programs emphasized defensible space around homes. A lesser-known countermeasure emerging from this era was installation of ember-resistant vents in structures near forest boundaries, reducing structure ignition probability by measurable margins during wind-driven events. Replacement was gradual and partial. Contract crews supplemented federal staff. Private firms provided aviation services. Some ranger duties shifted toward community liaison, environmental education, and collaboration with tribal nations on traditional burning practices. Budget allocations increasingly favored resilience and mitigation rather than sole suppression. A lesser-known command doctrine shift formalized integration of indigenous fire knowledge into management plans in several regions, acknowledging historical use of low-intensity burns to shape ecosystems. Yet the ranger persisted, not as solitary figure on horseback across endless acreage, but as node in network of sensors, aircraft, engines, and community meetings. The disturbing stories changed in character instead of isolated lightning strikes. In remote valleys, there were subdivisions built into former burn scars, evacuation orders affecting tens of thousands, smoke plumes visible from space. A lesser-known medical effect of this new era extended beyond personnel. Long-duration smoke exposure from megafires was associated with increases in emergency room visits for cardiovascular events in downwind urban populations. Legacy stretches wide. The incident command system, refined in wildfire response, now underpins disaster management across hurricanes, floods, and pandemics. Principles of interagency, cooperation, and modular organization trace lineage to fire lines and ranger stations. The balance of use and conservation continues to evolve, contested, and recalibrated. A lesser-known design compromise embedded in modern ranger stations involves hardened construction with fire-resistant materials, acknowledging that facilities themselves now sit within potential burn perimeters. This life, then, is not of a single person, though it borrows a voice of one. It is of a role shaped by fire, timber, law, climate, and politics. It began with 400 individuals guarding 150 million acres and grew into a system of tens of thousands across agencies and seasons. It endured mistakes of total suppression and learned cost of accumulated fuel. It adapted to aircraft and algorithms without abandoning boots and ash. The quiet moral is not of heroism, though there has been much of that. It is of humility before landscape measured in millions of acres and centuries of growth. The ranger learned that control is temporary, that management is negotiation with weather and terrain. And in the telling of disturbing stories, the deeper truth remains: forests remember every decision made in their name, long after the shift of any single human has ended. In 2020 alone, more than 10 million acres burned in the United States, the second highest annual total recorded at that time. That number did not belong to a single ranger, but it shaped the late adulthood of the ranger as an institution, because it proved that scale had outrun tradition. The problem that created the modern phase was not simply fire. It was expansion of the wildland-urban interface. Warehousing density within fire-prone ecosystems increased by more than 40% between 1990 and 2010. Homes pressed into chaparral, ponderosa pine, lodgepole, stands heavy with a century of suppressed undergrowth. Suppression budgets rose above $2 billion annually, sometimes consuming more than half of the total budget of the United States Forest Service. A lesser-known supply constraint emerged during severe seasons: shortages of qualified incident management team members forced some regions to operate with understaffed command units, stretching decision cycles during peak fire growth. Childhood lessons resurfaced in altered form. Early doctrine had treated every flame as enemy. Now some fires were monitored rather than extinguished, yet public expectation, shaped by decades of messaging, demanded visible action. Rangers found themselves explaining the logic of allowing certain lightning-caused fires to burn in remote areas to reduce fuel loads. A lesser-known command doctrine shift formalized the concept of appropriate management response, replacing blanket suppression language in policy documents and allowing discretion based on fuel, weather, and values at risk. Training evolved. Annual fire refreshes expanded to include modules on extreme fire behavior, plume diminuted events, and spotting distances exceeding 1 mile. Physical fitness standards remained demanding. Pack tests requiring 45 pounds carried over 3 miles in 45 minutes. However, mental resilience training gained emphasis after surveys indicated rising anxiety during record-breaking seasons. A lesser-known medical effect documented after the 2017 and 2018 fire seasons showed increased rates of heat-related illness among crews working in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit for consecutive days. Small changes continued to matter more than dramatic hardware. Improved predictive services, integrated satellite imagery, updated every 5 to 15 minutes, enabling faster detection of new starts. Handheld GPS units replaced paper maps in many districts, reducing navigation error during low visibility, smoke conditions. Fire-resistant clothing materials were upgraded to meet stricter thermal performance. Standards after laboratory testing demonstrated failure points under radiant heat flux above specific thresholds. A lesser-known production issue delayed distribution of new fire shelters one season when seam integrity tests revealed weakness under rapid deployment stress. Growth of the system around the ranger accelerated under pressure. Interagency coordination expanded to include not only federal and state partners, but also municipal departments and tribal governments. Shared databases tracked availability of engines, crews, and aircraft nationwide. During peak activity, more than 30,000 personnel could be mobilized across incidents. A lesser-known battlefield improvisation during the 2020s season involved rapid conversion of fairgrounds and college campuses into base camps structured for pandemic distancing, reducing disease transmission while maintaining operational capacity. The ranger role broadened beyond fire. Drought management, invasive species control, and recreation pressure intensify. Visitor numbers to national forests exceeded 160 million annually in some years, bringing increased search and rescue operations and resource damage mitigation. Law enforcement tasks included a response to illegal campfires during burn bans, with citations issued in the thousands during extreme seasons. A lesser-known countermeasure implemented in high-risk districts was deployment of remote camera systems at popular, dispersed camping areas, enabling rapid identification of unattended fires without constant physical patrol. Peak of the modern ranger may be measured not in acres saved, but in complexity managed. During simultaneous large incidents across multiple states, coordination required daily briefings involving meteorologists, logistics chiefs, aviation coordinators, and public information officers. In one particularly severe week, more than 80 large fires burned concurrently in the western United States. Resource allocation decisions balanced the protection of communities against ecological benefit of fire in remote wilderness. A lesser-known weather and terrain impact during extreme plume events involved fire-generated thunderstorms, producing dry lightning that ignited new fires miles from the original front. A defining scenario illustrates this phase. A wind-driven fire advanced toward a town of 25,000 residents at rates estimated above 3 miles per hour under humidity. Evacuation orders affected more than 18,000 people within 24 hours. Rangers and cooperating agencies deployed. Agents along defensible perimeters coordinated retardant drops from large air tankers and established structure protection groups street by street. A lesser-known crew training detail proved decisive. Prior community outreach had resulted in 62% of homes in the most threatened subdivision maintaining defensible space of at least 30 feet, significantly reducing structure loss. Why did the system hold in some places and fail in others? Because fire behavior under extreme drought and wind can exceed design parameters of suppression doctrine. Ember cast distances of over 1 mile overwhelmed lines constructed hours earlier. Yet in communities prepared with hardened structures and vegetation management, survival rates were markedly higher. A lesser-known test result from post-incident analysis showed that homes with non-combustible roofing had ignition probabilities reduced by more than half compared to wood-shake roofs. Under similar ember exposure, the cost to human beings deepened. Seasonal employment remained common, with many firefighters working temporary appointments without year-round benefits. Attrition increased as private sector opportunities offered higher pay for similar risk. Surveys conducted by advocacy groups suggested that more than 50% of federal wildland firefighters had considered leaving within a 2-year window. A lesser-known psychological effect observed in longitudinal studies indicated cumulative stress from repeated high-intensity seasons contributed to sleep disturbances and burnout. Even among experienced personnel, fatigue was no longer confined to frontline. Administrative burdens grew as documentation requirements expanded for environmental compliance and fiscal accountability. Rangers balanced emergency response with planning of fuel treatments, public meetings, and reporting. Survival math now included calculations of overtime limits and rest periods mandated to reduce accidents. A lesser-known supply constraint during prolonged campaigns involves scarcity of replacement chainsaw parts, with global supply chain disruptions delaying shipments and forcing cannibalization of damaged equipment. Old age of the traditional image became visible. The solitary ranger of the early 20th century, riding fence lines with revolver and notebook, yielded to teams operating within digital ecosystems. Recruitment materials emphasized diversity of skills, ecology, communications, engineering. The badge remained, but symbolism shifted from frontier lawman to environmental manager. A lesser-known command doctrine shift institutionalized use of risk-informed decision-making frameworks, requiring explicit documentation of trade-offs between firefighter exposure and values protected. Replacement, however, was not erasure. Instead, adaptation layered over foundation. Unmanned aerial systems supplemented but did not replace boots on ground. Satellite detection accelerated response but still required human interpretation. Prescribed fire programs expanded, with millions of acres treated annually across federal, state, and tribal lands to reduce fuel accumulation. A lesser-known countermeasure, adopted in several regions, involved expansion of shaded fuel breaks along strategic ridgelines, blending mechanical thinning with prescribed burns to slow potential megafire spread. Legacy of the Ranger now extends beyond forest boundary. Incident command system structures, refined in wildfire, guide responses to hurricanes and public health crises. Concepts of mutual aid and modular organization have become standard in emergency management doctrine. Community wildfire protection plans, often facilitated by rangers, empower local residents to share responsibility for risk reduction. A lesser-known design compromise in modern fire apparatus reflects lessons learned. Engines built for wildland urban interface response. Balance off-road capability with urban pump capacity, sacrificing maximum speed for versatility. This life continues, altered but not ended. The Ranger remains witness to disturbing stories of drought-stricken hillsides, of beetle-killed stands stretching to horizon, of subdivisions built in corridors of flame. Yet there are also stories of restoration, of forests thinned and burned under careful prescription, of communities hardened against ember storms. The arithmetic remains daunting. Millions of acres and thousands of personnel against forces of weather and terrain. A lesser-known medical effect of long-term smoke seasons now draws research attention. Chronic exposure among residents of fire-prone regions has been linked to increased incidence of respiratory conditions, reinforcing connection between forest management and public health. The biography of the Ranger is therefore a biography of adaptation, born of overcut timber and catastrophic fire, shaped by doctrine of suppression, matured into complex system of science and coordination, tested by climate and expansion of human settlement. It demanded strength of body, clarity of judgment, and willingness to revise belief in face of evidence. The disturbing stories are not of monsters and trees, but of consequences measured in acres and lungs, in budgets and burnout. And the quiet moral that remains at the edge of every fire line is this: stewardship of land is negotiation with time, and time does not yield to wishful thinking.